On the 19th of May 1536, Anne Boleyn, the Queen of England, walked out to the executioner's scaffold, and in front of a small crowd she would be beheaded in one swift and strong strike of the executioner's sword. The crowd gasped as they saw the once mighty Queen's head hit the wooden structure, but then the executioner hurriedly made his way away, as his duty had been done. Anne Boleyn has been considered the most important consort that a monarch has ever had in England, and her marriage to Henry VIII would change England forever. She would force the king to get a divorce and annulment that would split the face of English religion, and Henry tore the country away from the direction and religious instruction of the Pope, which also offended most of Europe. But Anne Boleyn herself would fall from grace, and she would meet a terrifying end inside the walls of the greatly feared Tower of London. But following her death, the body of Anne Boleyn was taken into the quiet and small chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, where it was then buried by a number of mysterious ladies who saw it as their duty to bury the former mistress. But Anne Boleyn's remains and body would be later disturbed, and they were exhumed. But there is a great amount of controversy and scandal around this. But what is the story of digging up Anne Boleyn? It was the king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, who was tasked with getting the king out of his second marriage to Anne Boleyn, and he would expertly create a web of scandal and deceit against her. This would force her split with the king and would then secure her execution. The marriage of Anne and Henry VIII was not the most popular, and it split many of the king's closest friends and advisers, and it would cause a huge strain in England. Many saw Anne as a home-wrecker, and Henry then would fall in love with Jane Seymour, the Queen's lady-in-waiting. Many people could not accept Anne Boleyn as queen, and they viewed the marriage of the royal couple as unlawful and against God. But Anne was still made the Queen of England, and people were forced to then swear their allegiance to her. Thomas More could not accept her, and this would then result in his execution, with More losing his head on Tower Green. But the king would grow frustrated of Anne, and he would then not get the male heir that he greatly wanted from her. With his increasing interest in Jane Seymour, Cromwell would go into overdrive and would get rid of her. Henry neglected Anne Boleyn, and Jane would be caught in compromising situations with him, including when she was caught sitting on his knee, and Anne would become incredibly stressed. She must have known her downfall would come, but Cromwell would try to gather evidence against her, and he had Anne Boleyn investigated for many charges, which even included incest with her own brother. She was also accused of adultery behind the king's back with 4 other men, and high treason, which shocked the nation. Those who found themselves accused were hastily sentenced to death, and were then executed on Tower Hill, and this included Anne's brother George, who would lose his head. But Anne Boleyn was then taken to the Tower of London, and she would never leave the infamous and terrifying fortress, which became associated with torture. She was brought to trial, and this took place inside the Tower of London, and the male-dominated jury and tribunal sentenced her to death after finding her guilty of the charges. It was a shocking downfall that would see Anne lose her head in possibly the most profound and brutal execution in English history. Her execution took place on the 19th of May 1536, and Anne was led out of her lodgings to the short walk to the scaffold, which had been made next to the White Tower on Tower Green. She climbed the stairs, and it was said she gracefully addressed the people from the scaffold with a voice somewhat overcome by weakness, which gathered strength as she went on. She begged them to pray for her king, in whom she had always found great kindness. The spectators could not refrain from tears. She then said goodbye to her ladies-in-waiting, and the executioner faced her, armed with his sword, to perform the job cleaner. Henry ordered a French swordsman to come to complete the bloody job of taking his wife's head. The expert executioner performed his job, and Anne's head was struck clean off in one stroke, to the gasp of witnesses. After the execution had taken place, the usual protocol was adhered to. On Tower Hill, this meant that the bodies were placed inside of a bow-stave chest, and they were then taken into the Tower of London to be buried inside of the Tower's chapel, the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. The same protocol took place in the Tower of London with Anne Boleyn, and her remains were collected by her ladies-in-waiting in an oak chest. They then carried the remains of the Queen into the chapel, and they then buried her in a grave near to the altar of the chapel. But under the floors of the Tudor chapel are the remains of around 1,500 people, many who were executed. It was the place where many of the Tower's most famous prisoners were buried, and also where Henry VIII's fifth Queen and Anne Boleyn's brother were laid to rest. Even Thomas Cromwell was buried inside of this chapel. But Anne was the second person laid to rest near to the high altar in the chapel during the Tudor period, and there were later 13 other men and women who would be buried near to the chancel and the altar. However, those who were executed for serious crimes would not have a grave marker, and these resting places were kept secret, and it meant that Anne's body was just practically dumped in a roughly dug grave. But there was a register of the burials kept, and it was written in that the corpses with the heads are buried in the chapel in the tower at the high altar. The plan of the burials showed that Anne had been buried to the left of the altar, and more burials took place as the years rolled on. But the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula would become rather run down and dilapidated throughout the years, and when Queen Victoria visited the chapel in the 19th century, she would order that the chapel should be renovated, as it was not a place for the burials of such important people. During Victoria's reign, big renovations and changes were made to the chapel, and Victoria ordered the work, and she ordered that the decoration in the chapel should be improved and that there should be a new heating system. These plans were drawn up, and there was a lot of restoration work, but it meant that the resting places of the most famous people would be disturbed. The pavement of the chapel had sunk and was uneven, and when these stones were lifted, the bodies of the deceased were uncovered. All of the remains were discovered under the chapel, and these were then placed and locked in boxes when they were removed, and then on the boxes inscriptions were written. The floor would then be relaid, but the high altar, where Anne Boleyn had been buried, was then subjected to renovation. On the 9th of November 1876, the remains of Anne Boleyn were discovered, and they were then taken from the grave. She had been laying at rest for over 300 years, and whilst everyone outside the tower had a normal day, within the tower's walls the remains and body of the most infamous Queen of England were being dug up. At around 12:30 p.m, 5 workers got together around the high altar, and using the plan of the burials, they located Anne Boleyn's remains and then excavated them. They then lifted the pavement first and removed the earth very carefully, and they dug 2 feet down, and then Anne's remains were found. All her bones had been piled together in one spot, but the remains had been disturbed previously, as the coffin of another woman buried nearby had caused problems with Anne's burial. The man who was in charge of the exhumation of Anne Boleyn was Dr. Frederick Mowat, who would record and receive the bones of Anne Boleyn. He wrote of them that a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been of slender and perfect proportions. The forehead and lower jaw were small and especially well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint, the atlas, which was then next to the skull, and that they bore witness to the Queen's little neck. But then he would take a more thorough examination of her remains, and it was said that the bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull, with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and a rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebrae and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height, with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hand and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet, with tapering fingers and a narrow foot. It was estimated that Anne was between 5 foot to 5'3" tall, and it was confirmed that her body had been beheaded before it was laid to rest. The men who had exhumed the body of Anne Boleyn all commented that it was a female body, and after the exhumation process had taken place, the remains were handed over to the governor of the Tower of London. He then housed these inside his personal residence, the Queen's House, for a period of time, but more bodies were found, including those of Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, and also Margaret Pole. Following the inspection, the remains of Anne Boleyn were then held inside the Queen's House in the Tower of London for 5 months whilst the work was completed. But then Anne Boleyn would be returned to her burial site in a more dignified manner. On the 13th of April, 1877, workers at midday, accompanied by the resident priest of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, would gather near the high altar. Each of the excavated bodies were placed inside new specifically made caskets, and Anne Boleyn's casket was encased in lead and was then held together with copper screws, and an etching was made onto the coffin. This marked that Anne was inside it, and also the year she passed away and the date she was reburied. Anne Boleyn's burial site today is marked by a decorative floor tile and is very moving and a quiet place where she is interred. Anne Boleyn is seen as a victim of her husband Henry VIII and Cromwell, and she did not deserve her execution, which was completely brutal and barbaric. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.